In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
All right, welcome Sublation Media viewers and Sublation Media readers and all you Sublators out there. I'm Douglas Lane, the host of the Sublation Magazine show and the author of the novel Bash Bash Revolution, which is my standby for my bio at the beginning. With me today, as always, Benjamin Studebaker. Ben, you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, it's me, Benjamin Studebaker, author of The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut, and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies.
All right, so as some of you know, my life has been disrupted. I have not been able to, I have lots of things I'm juggling, so I've not been able to keep up with the news, which I think makes me into kind of an ordinary person. I think most people are like me. They might vaguely hear something about world events or politics, but they don't track it, and that's where I'm at right now. So Ben, your job nowadays is to keep me informed about what's going on in the world. I understand there's a new peace deal in Gaza. I don't know even what the left's response to it has been, whether people are excited about it or they are skeptical about it. I understand it has to do with an international coalition taking power that's headed up by Tony Blair, and that Hamas has signed up for this. Also, some people are very upset about how Trump is handling the border situation. And those are the two news items that we'll be talking about today. So where do you want to start?
Well, it seems that the peace deal in Gaza that we talked a little bit about last week is advancing along. It seems that phase one seems to be going more or less according to plan. Now, Hamas's potential objections, the things that Hamas might want to further negotiate, are not really part of phase one. They come at a later point once we really get to the stage at which this international force is meant to come in. And this international force, as we discussed a little bit last week, is supposed to have Palestinian troops providing security, but these Palestinian troops will not be under the PA, at least not initially, until the PA undergoes some kind of process of reform. It will instead be a kind of international leadership, perhaps with Tony Blair, who's explicitly named. And then the troops will be trained by the Egyptians and the Jordanians with funding, not just for this security apparatus, but with intent to redevelop and rebuild Gaza, coming from the Gulf states, from states like Qatar and the UAE. So It involves an enormous number of states. The left's attitude to it seems to be confusion and upset, because the left has been talking as if all of the states in the region were facilitating ethnic cleansing, genocide. But in point of fact, this agreement calls for the Gazans to remain in Gaza, no population transfer, no movement of large numbers of Gazan refugees to Europe or North America or into the concentration camp that the Egyptians built as a contingency plan in the Sinai. So if it goes through, will prevent all of that from taking place, all of that which was assumed to be the goal by many on the left.
Oh, well, my question is, what is the plan in the short term to make life in Gaza more plausible and hospitable? Is there any talk of that?
Yeah, Israel is to withdraw, and then humanitarian aid is to be brought in, large quantities of humanitarian aid. So that's the plan in terms of preventing the humanitarian crisis from further escalating.
Mm-hmm.
For that to happen, Hamas has to do the things that it has agreed to do. This includes releasing the hostages. It also includes getting ready to transition to not being in charge of Gaza, because Israel's withdrawal is predicated on Hamas not being the entity providing security there.
Right. So Right. Many people on the left in the pro-Palestinian movement in the West assumed that the purpose of the attacks on Gaza was to perpetrate genocide, and that the definition of genocide was somewhat fluid. It would sometimes mean the actual elimination of the population. Other times, the UN definition was what people were referring to. Um, but as you say, that is not going to be the outcome yet. The long termers, the old timers would probably say this will be a return to the slow genocide of the Palestinian people. You know,
Yes, they will raise the fact that this doesn't obviously lead to a two-state solution. But
right.
there is nothing that was on the table that would obviously lead to that. There was no reason to think that this crisis would generate a two-state or one-state solution. No reason to think that at all. What there was a reason to think is that perhaps it would be possible to stop the humanitarian crisis, prevent ethnic cleansing. And in part because the argument from the hardcore crowd has been that this is all about ethnic cleansing and genocide, averting that outcome will now look like a big success. Even if it means that you continue to have Gaza as more or less a prison camp.
Whose success is it?
A success for the states.
Right.
So for the United States and for the partner states in the region, potentially a success for Tony Blair, depending on whether he does in fact have the role that he's been described as potentially having, and whether that administration is perceived to actually be successful in establishing some kind of security in the region that's not Hamas based.
Is this considered? Go ahead.
Now that could potentially be very beneficial down the line if it were in fact to occur. If it became the case that Gaza was stable without Hamas present, it would then be more difficult to rationalize things like a blockade or the maintenance of heavy securitization that prevents Gazans from living and working in Israeli territory. If it is in fact the case that it's possible to have some other security arrangement that isn't Hamas in Gaza, the blockade will become much more difficult to legitimate, and it may end.
Right. But are people considering this a victory for Hamas or for the Palestinians?
It would be hard to see how it could be framed as that. And I don't think too many people have been doing that. That would look fairly ignorant to me, because this agreement calls for Hamas to give up control of Gaza, something Hamas would not have agreed to even in general prior to the use of force. So to try to frame it as a victory for Hamas doesn't make any sense. It's an agreement that calls for Hamas to cede control of the territory. At the same time, it's also difficult to frame it as a victory for Netanyahu, because Netanyahu tried to portray Hamas's acceptance of the terms as not, in fact, an acceptance, on the grounds that Netanyahu doesn't think Hamas is actually going to be willing to carry out, especially the later parts of the deal. And on that basis, Netanyahu thinks that it's a waste of time and a waste of potential opportunity to actually get rid of Hamas and do further damage to Hamas to go through this ceasefire exercise.
What, remind me again, the later parts of the deal would be disarming and turning over the hostages?
So the hostages are early. The later part of the deal is to make way for this transitional authority. And Hamas has said that they would like to have some kind of say over what happens. They'd like to be part of a group of Palestinian organizations that have some kind of say. And they're concerned about the lack of a role for Palestinians in the later parts of the peace deal. The Palestinians are supposed to be the bodies that do the security work, but they're supposed to be under other people's command, trained by other people. The PA isn't in charge of them. Hamas is not in charge of them. So there's some questions by the Palestinians about whether they're actually going to be able to have any say really in what happens or in what takes place after this is all done.
I am reminded, tell me if this is an association that makes sense to you, of the early days of the occupation of Iraq, and the way interim government was set up with Iraqi security. And I recall that it was difficult to get Iraqi security to really provide the force necessary to achieve peace and order after the occupation began, after the invasion and occupation.
One of the obvious questions is if this is something that Israel is willing to permit, so if Israel will withdraw to allow this thing to come into existence, is this thing not a puppet entity of Israel? Anything that Israel would permit to be established is going to do things that Israel is okay with. So anything that Israel will permit in Gaza will strike some Palestinians as a puppet regime of Israel. That said, the alternative is for Israel to continue to occupy the territory directly and to continue to deepen the humanitarian crisis there as Israel does enormous amounts of damage in the course of trying to root out Hamas.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps in the course of trying to generate a situation in which there can be population movement.
So do you think this is going to change the relationship between the United States and Israel going forward, that given how this peace deal was put together over the objections of Netanyahu?
I don't think it's going to radically change the relationship. I think that Netanyahu knows that it's necessary to have these other states at least tolerating Israeli behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And that, of course, in principle, there is some limit on what Israel can do before other states will not tolerate that behavior and will start to pressure Israel to change what it's doing. I think that Netanyahu has played his hand aggressively. He's tried to see how far he can push it. He's tried to see what other states will allow. For Netanyahu, October 7th was potentially a licensing event. So October 7th gave him room to do things and try things that he couldn't otherwise have done and tried. But of course, there is a limit to what he will be permitted to do and try. And his goal, I think, was to find that limit and see how far out it was. And the first evidence of the limit was that when they asked Egypt to take the Gazan population, Egypt said, no, we won't do that. When they asked other states to pay Egypt to get Egypt to do it, those states said, no, we won't pay Egypt to do that.
Mm-hmm.
No, you're not going to be able to displace the population in Gaza. If you create a humanitarian disaster there, you're going to look like murderers, and it's going to be a big problem for you. So therefore, you're going to have to back off at some stage.
Mm-hmm.
And this is that stage.
Right. It's been a long time coming, but this is that stage. So the big pitfalls here will be down the road in terms of providing true security for Gaza. And also, if Hamas doesn't turn over the hostages or disarm, we could see this all fall apart. Is there a way in which Israel could step in to disrupt this process at this point, without those, basically without Hamas?
They'd have to persuade the partner states that Hamas is not following the terms.
They can't act
unilaterally.
unilaterally.
They immediately attempted to do that. They claimed that Hamas's agreement was not a real agreement and that it should be taken to be disagreement. And Trump said to Netanyahu, why are you so fucking negative all the time?
Mm-hmm.
And then they proceeded to operate on the basis that Hamas had agreed to the terms, at least in principle. They'd agreed to a framework, the details of which could be ironed out. So to be able to continue acting, I think Israel would have to persuade the partner states that Hamas has violated the terms. And maybe Hamas will violate the terms. It remains to be seen.
what would be the rationale for violating the terms if you're Hamas?
If Hamas just did this to try to get a reprieve so that Hamas could perhaps move things around, reoccupy some territory, transport some stuff around that currently it's very difficult to transport around. Sometimes a ceasefire can be used, as a respite to reconfigure.
Mm-hmm.
That's possible, but I doubt that's the case.
Right. Yeah.
I don't really see how they can continue for any great length of time, given the worsening humanitarian conditions.
Right. And also the damage done to Hamas and Hamas's leadership.
Yeah. And this is important to bear in mind. The major factor in getting Hamas to agree to something like this framework is the violence and force that has been deployed. It's not something that Hamas would have agreed to on October 6th.
Right. Right. And they've, if I'm hearing you correctly, they've even lost some ground since the last time there was a peace agreement where they were going to be included in a coalition government of Gaza. That is no longer on the table because there won't be a Palestinian Authority in Gaza. Am I remembering
at least
correctly?
not initially. At least not initially. And something Hamas would like to negotiate for is some possibility of having some seat at the table insofar as the Palestinians are included, and to maximize the degree to which the Palestinians are included. These will be the kinds of things that Hamas tries to get in any further talks that occur.
All right. So, it seems as though there's been some movement since last time we talked about this, but that a lot remains to be seen.
It's progressing. It
Yeah.
does seem to be progressing. And this is, and it bears reiterating, in case people didn't watch last week's episode, this is a deal that Anthony Blinken, Biden's Secretary of State, takes credit for. He claims that they had something like this framework in the drawer waiting for the new administration, and that once the new administration stopped it with that silly Mara Gaza stuff and reopened the files and took out the Biden plan, they were good to go. So this is a bipartisan thing. It's got support from Democrats and Republicans and from Europeans. It's got Tony Blair. It's got Arab states involved. There's a lot of different parties that are for this. So if it doesn't happen, there are a lot of people who are going to be really ticked off.
Someone says in the chat that the point of October 7th was to have a seat at the table with respect to the Abraham Accords, not for the Palestinians, but for Hamas, the IRGC, and et cetera. Would you agree with that?
I don't know that I would agree with that. I don't think that is going to be accomplished by this. I don't think this is going to get Hamas a seat at the table that they would not otherwise have had.
Right. Well, it doesn't mean that they've accomplished that. It just means that was the point.
I wouldn't say that would be the goal of October 7th, though, but it's difficult to interpret things like what's the goal of October 7th.
Right. Yeah. You would hope that it would be possible to interpret what the Hamas's goal was with October 7th. If you were, a general in the Pentagon, you would want to know what their goal is, right? Or if you were Netanyahu, you'd want to know what Hamas.
Part of the difficulty is if you have an organization that there's questions about to what degree everything is happening through a centralized command structure and to what degree people are taking initiative. Then you have an event like October 7th, which includes a lot of different things. There's what they thought they were going to do. There's what in fact happened. There's stuff that they had a contingency plan for in the event that they were successful. What would they do? There's stuff people just did because they seemed to have opportunities to do it. I interpret October 7th a lot like January 6th. There are people who showed up on January 6th with various kinds of intentions. Most of these people got further than they expected to get and didn't necessarily have a plan for what to do. And then the things that they did, it's assumed that there was leadership that intended these things or planned these things. when in point of fact, in a lot of these cases, it was people acting in a disorganized ad hoc basis in a situation they didn't anticipate actually being in. And that had to do with Israeli troop deployments. Israeli troops were not deployed where Hamas expected them to be deployed because Israel's military was focused on affairs in the West Bank. So there was a lack of resistance on October 7th, which surprised and shocked the Hamas troops as they came in. And then they had to decide what to do in that situation. They never expected to be able to enter in or to have any question about penetrating, any great distance into Israel. That was not something that they thought was going to occur.
So, what is the consequence domestically for the United States?
In the United States?
Yeah, for Trump and for domestic politics.
Well, it will cause Trump to claim that he's the peace president. It will be his piece of evidence that he has, insofar as this deal works, that he is committed to peace. He will try to claim that he's committed to peace in a way that Biden was not, even though the deal will have been a framework that Biden had begun negotiating out with these other stakeholders.
Mm-hmm.
So that will be what he'll try to do with it. It will also get him some cover. So when people allege that he has negative military hostile intentions on the basis of his behavior in other parts of the world, say Venezuela or Ukraine, he will use this to say, no, he's interested and committed to peace. It's other people who are causing the trouble.
In Ukraine, it does seem that that Trump had hoped for a peace deal to come together there that was thwarted by both Russia and Ukraine.
He had an unrealistic notion of that conflict. I don't think he really understood why it was taking place. His assumption was if he had been around at the relevant stage, it just wouldn't have happened because it was a communication failure.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think he took seriously why that conflict was occurring, at
Mm-hmm.
least not in his public statements. It may be that privately he has a different view.
Right. But you think his actions have demonstrated that people in the White House understand the seriousness of that conflict and how intractable it is, perhaps?
Maybe. I think that they had to at least make a show of trying to negotiate an end to it, to maintain their public claim that the Biden administration was negligent in allowing the conflict to take place. They had to attempt to end it. And then the attempt to end it has to appear to have been thwarted by the parties.
Right.
So, we've discovered they hate each other so much. This is so unreasonable how much they hate each other. That becomes the frame.
Mm-hmm.
But if they really believed that, then they didn't really grasp the conflict. And if they did grasp the conflict, then they pretended not to understand it in public so as to make the Biden administration appear responsible.
Right. Okay. So this is a win for Trump. It remains to be seen how substantial a win it will be, whether or not it will truly end the conflict in Gaza. But we can hope that it will. But the other article of news that you sent to me was about troops at the border and the GOP rebelling against Trump, or at least former GOP members rebelling against Trump's orders at the border, which include, taking aim and firing on people trying to get across the border. Is that
Venezuela? This is
Oh,
about.
this is Venezuela. Okay, I'm not tracking.
It's not the southern border. It's related to the border because, of
Mm-hmm.
course, there was a substantial number of Venezuelans that the Biden administration permitted to come to the United States, in part as political refugees. The Biden administration betrayed the Venezuelan opposition because during the period when oil prices were high, the Biden administration relaxed its opposition to Maduro.
Mm-hmm.
And then to avoid hanging all of the pro-American people in Venezuela out to dry, the Biden administration made a blanket amnesty offer to Venezuelans. So if they came to the United States, they would be permitted to stay on the basis that they're from Venezuela.
Mm-hmm.
So this allowed the Biden administration to abandon the effort to get rid of Maduro, while at the same time protecting the people who had taken personal risks on behalf of that effort.
Mm-hmm.
The Trump administration views this as a vector for allowing too many people from Venezuela into the United States with too little vetting. So it's one of the immigration decisions of the Biden administration that the Trump administration doesn't like. The Trump administration can, of course, say now after the fact that they should have kept the pressure up on Maduro and that they were being soft on the communists by relieving the pressure. But there were material reasons to relieve the pressure that were to do with the oil prices and the specific post-COVID energy situation. And probably if the Trump administration were around, they would have found a way to do the same thing. But now, of course, after the fact, since they weren't there then, they can just say, wow, he's so soft on Maduro, this narco guy who brings all of these drugs into the country. And of course, Maduro denies that he brings all of these drugs into the country. He denies that he is running a narco state, but this is the contentious issue. Now, the reason I raised this thing that's going on in Venezuela and think it's very interesting, that Politico story I sent you, it's got quotes from various Bush administration officials claiming that this is potentially illegal warfare because Trump is attacking boats on the basis that they're drug cartel boats with the U.S. military. So he's using the military to enforce drug policy. Now, Rubio has declared the organization that is commanding the boats, ostensibly commanding the boats, it's difficult to prove that the Trump administration is striking, it's been labeled a terrorist organization. And because the strikes are taking place over a short period of time with no troop deployment, they're happening from the air. You're talking about missiles and drones and planes and things that can happen very quickly in a short space of time. The War Powers Resolution gives the president very wide capacity to deploy military force, provided that it occurs in a short window of time, and it's applied to a type of organization that there's authorization for use of force against. So if you label something a terrorist organization, in the law, the president is authorized to use force against terrorist organizations. And so there's a kind of prima facie legal case that the Trump administration has through the War Powers Resolution and the counterterrorism authority that the president has to strike these boats, even though what the administration seems to be doing is engaging in drug law enforcement activity. And the Bush administration officials are upset that this is happening, and they deny that their activity in the 2000s laid the track for this. And they deny that the Obama administration's drone striking of people without trial laid the track for this. And they're making quotes to the media saying that Trump needs to get a declaration of war on Venezuela even to be able to do this. All of this, I think, is remarkable. That now you've got Bush administration, Obama administration people trying to pitch this as illegal warfare. It is clearly a violation of the norms that those administrations assumed would be followed with regard to how this power would be deployed. These administrations assume the president would be using this against Islamic terrorist organizations in the Middle East. They did not think that the president would use this power against drug cartels. But of course, once you have a category terrorist organization against which the president has the right to use drones and planes and missiles, provided he doesn't deploy ground troops for a long period of time, the amount of things that the U.S. military can do without deploying ground troops for a long period of time keeps getting bigger as military technology is developed, which makes the Air Force and the drones and the missiles a larger and larger part of the U.S. military. 80% of the casualties in the war in Ukraine are caused by drones. So you don't need to deploy U.S. troops for anything like the period of time that would be in violation of the War Powers Resolution to do an enormous amount of damage with the U.S. military at this stage. The War Powers Resolution, therefore, gives the president more or less a blank check to use anything in the sky that hits quick and doesn't involve a long-term deployment against any organization that the president can vaguely suggest is a terrorist organization. If you could declare that it's a terrorist organization, you seem legally to be able to do this based on the rules as they've been written. So, of course, what's needed is for Congress to amend the War Powers Resolution, pass legislation which qualifies that. But Congress isn't going to do that. And why is Congress not going to do that? Because, of course, it is, from the point of view of Congress, necessary for the president to have the discretionary authority to use this stuff within a more normatively restricted terrain of what counts as a terrorist organization. So the alternative then would be to usurp the president, the executive branch's power to designate what is or isn't a terrorist organization and take that power back and give it to Congress. But what? Then we're going to have debates in Congress about what counts as a terrorist organization? That will draw a lot of public attention. Nobody wants that. So it's because nobody really wants Congress to play the role that this is possible. And yet they want to get the Trump administration to stop doing this without restoring Congress's role in regulating the president's authority. So they're trying to make it into a legal argument, and they want to try it in the court of public opinion and potentially in front of the Supreme Court. But it seems very difficult to me to see how they would win a legal case in the Supreme Court on this basis, given what they're really arguing is that it's a violation of norms, or that there's been a blurring of the distinction between crime and warfare. Well, yeah, no shit, Sherlock. There's been a blurring of the distinction between crime and warfare. That's what the whole war on terror was, a blurring of the distinction between crime and warfare. That's what it was, you guys. You did that. You did that. That's what the Patriot Act is, you fucking morons. It's incredible. But here we are.
My mother is paging me, so I want you to continue on without me for a little bit longer if you can. I'll be right back.
I can. Yeah, so it's a Politico article in which former Bush administration officials allege this. And I just think it's hilarious that it's Bush administration officials giving quotes to Politico about this. The irony on it is so heavy and so enormous. But yeah, it's interesting because there is really no floating of Congress taking back any of these powers. It gets talked about now and then. Oh, yeah, if you'd like to stop the tariffing, Congress would have to take back the power to tariff. Every once in a while it gets floated, but no one seriously wants to go through with it. And I think the reason, by the way, that nobody seriously wants Congress recovering powers, in addition to, then you would have a public discussion, which could potentially generate legitimation issues, is also a change in the time preference. So there's this shortened time preference for making decisions. A lot of the time now, the feeling is that if you can't act very quickly, the opportunity for effective action will pass, and that the kind of debate that you get in a legislative body like the Congress, that kind of debate takes too long to permit effective action in many different areas. And this is particularly true in the military. One of the things they've been discussing recently is this possibility that you could use large language models or other kinds of artificial intelligence to select targets for the military. And the reason they're interested in this is that if you can select targets faster than human beings would be able to select targets, then you can decide to attack more quickly. And this can give you a temporal advantage over the adversary. Even if you and the adversary have the same raw military capability, if you can select targets and order attacks to begin faster than the adversary, even if you have exactly the same hardware, because you make decisions more quickly, you will prevail. And you might notice this in real-time strategy games like Empire Earth or Age of Empires. The people who are really good at real-time strategy games are good at them because they make decisions very quickly and they use hotkeys to just make many, many, many decisions very, very fast. And even if some of the decisions are bad or wrong decisions, the fact that they make so many decisions so quickly gives them a military advantage. And so for this reason, it's not just that they don't want there to be a debate in the Congress. It's also that Congress is not fast enough as a body. As an institution, it's not functionally quick. And therefore, there is an actual military need for very rapid executive decision-making. And it's for this reason that all they can do is appeal to norms or to try to suggest that they'll do something legal with it. They don't actually have a capacity politically or militarily to restore this power to the Congress, even though the Constitution says that it's a congressional power. In point of fact, modernity has advanced beyond the stage at which a legislative body can effectively take these kinds of decisions.
I missed a lot there. Sorry about that. But I what I had wanted to say before I was paged is that when the Patriot Act was put together, when the war on terror got started, the common sense received opinion on the left was that, of course, this meant that just about anybody or any organization could be targeted by the U.S. military as an enemy combatant. And there was concern that left radical organizations in the United States could be labeled as terrorist organizations, and they had been in the past under Bill Clinton. There wasn't that category under Bill Clinton, but the penalty for direct action, say if you were an ecological activist, became quite severe under Clinton because you were now an eco-terrorist. And now, so it seems to me that it is quite natural, and it was pretty much unavoidable that something like what Trump is doing would be done. And I don't think that those so-called norms would have held for any president. That they may have held for some presidents, but they were not going to hold indefinitely. And my kind of instinct is they hadn't really held, that there were other instances where that terrorist designation had been used outside of the realm of Middle Eastern terrorism, or the list of organizations that they had started with.
Yes, though there tends to be more resistance to it when it's deployed against U.S. citizens in the territory of the United States. Barack Obama was able to target U.S. citizens in the Middle East involved in Islamic terrorist organizations. But there has been considerable resistance, for instance, in the case of Mangione, to the attempt to label him a terrorist. I think that the attempt to get him on terrorism was unsuccessful. I haven't checked this recently, but my impression is that they're going to have to try him more conventionally, that the attempt by the state of New York to use the terrorism designation fell through.
Well, with the case of Mangione, I subscribe to the Walter Kern theory of Mangione, which is the novelist's speculation rather than any kind of serious appraisal, but one that I would not be surprised to see come together and be acted out, which is that Mangione, if given a fair trial, will not be, they won't be able to obtain a conviction for him. And that his future will include being some sort of pundit in the liberal media.
Entirely possible. I have no idea what the facts are of that case or what the evidence is.
Right. Well, just the evidence seems to me to be thinner than we are led to believe. But I again, this is the Walter Kern novelist of the unbinding and up in the air, and it's speculation how he would write it if he wrote it as fiction. Yeah. But go ahead.
To prove the terrorism claim, they do seem to have to show some sort of intent to have political effect.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a question of, okay, you could have a political motivation. It could be that you're mad about healthcare that you do this, but that would be different from trying to obtain a particular policy outcome or political outcome through the violence. So was he trying to make a revolution? Was he trying to get something like Medicare for all? Or was he just mad about the healthcare sector? If you're just mad about the healthcare sector, but you're not trying to accomplish something in particular, is it terrorist activity? And if you're not in an organization which has organizational goals, if you're just acting as an individual who's very angry, is it terrorist activity? There does seem to be some resistance on the part of the courts to the idea that people acting alone who are just mad about politics can be designated as terrorists.
Right. No, the Mangione case is one where conspiracy theory and speculation is particularly tempting due to the character of the assassination, the way it was staged, and the way it had been immediately taken up. The fact that there are some organizations on the left that have made a folk hero out of him almost immediately. So I don't want to say too much more about Mangione in that direction, except just to say that, I doubt, for a variety of reasons, I doubt they're going to pin him as a terrorist. Get that label on him.
Anyway, to follow up on what we were talking about.
Yeah, sorry.
It was this question of temporality. So the need to make decisions quickly being a reason that you can't restore powers to the legislature, even if those powers formally belong to the legislature within the constitutional scheme. Relatedly, I think this is a big part of why so much of our public debate now is about electeds versus bureaucrats in the executive branch.
Mm-hmm.
If your electeds are no longer meaningfully circumscribed by the Congress in a lot of different areas because it's been understood that Congress can't act on a sufficient timeline to play that role effectively, then your civil servants and bureaucrats become your check.
Mm-hmm.
And so for a lot of people who previously would have expected Congress to play the checking role, those people have deferred not just to the courts, but to the civil servants and bureaucrats as providing the check. And so for these people, part of the reason why they have come on the side of technocracy and administration is that the legislature is not a feasible alternative.
Right. But
given the way the technology has changed.
Recently, though, authority was given back to the courts in a Supreme Court decision called...
Yes, the courts asserted that they did not have to defer to the civil servants with regard to adjudicating these disputes. But of course, the disputes are increasingly between electeds and civil servants. So the court increasingly is adjudicating disputes within the executive branch rather than disputes between Congress and the executive branch. As Congress backs off, you get the fourth branch of government becomes the legislative branch to a very substantial degree, because so much of the activity of the state is done through executive order and through the interpretation of executive order, or the interpretation of legal statutes that have been written to give the executive a large amount of discretion. So you'll have a case where the question is the Trump administration's tariffs legal? The question of whether the tariffs are legal is a question of whether, when Congress gave all of this emergency tariffing power to the executive branch, whether that power was defined narrowly enough so as to block what is currently being done. But of course, the purpose and function of the legislation which gave that power to the president was Congress acknowledging we don't take decisions fast enough to be able to effectively use this power, so we have to give it up. So it's going to be hard to use legislation that Congress passed, which was an admission and an acknowledgement that we're slow and we can't act, to circumscribe what the executive branch can do. And there was all this expectation that civil servants and impersonal bureaucrats would take on a role which a politicized branch, the legislature, the Congress, previously had. Well, if the impersonal civil servants take on the role that elected congressional representatives previously had, then they will, of course, develop a political valence and come to appear as political actors. And then you won't be able to appeal to their impersonal expertise, because that expertise will be politicized by their having exercised it in the name of something like a legislative function.
Right. But my question is, has the Congress become more encumbered so that they can't act decisively?
Some of it is that Congress has become more encumbered. Some of it is that Congress is just not fast enough to act on a timeline that's increasingly the relevant timeline for making decisions. And some of it is that Congress has become fanciful and silly as a consequence over time of its giving up power for these other two reasons. So Congress has become less competent because it no longer needs to perform these roles and has given these roles up for these other reasons that already existed. When you had a competent Congress, it was still the case that Congress would sometimes have divisions in it that would make it slow to act, and that the timeline for action would be motivated by technological change in such a way that even if Congress were taking decisions on a normal timeline, that timeline would not be fast enough. So Congress acknowledged sometimes we're slow, and sometimes even when we're fast, we're not fast enough. So we'll give this power up. And then as they give these powers up, the members of Congress spend more and more of their time doing stupid stuff that isn't really relevant.
Can you give me a couple of examples of the kinds of things that you think of when you think of this?
They waste all this time making little television adverts for the C-SPAN audience. They go and give these speeches to nobody in the room that are about trying to change the electoral situation, change the polling situation, aren't actually to do with making legislation. A lot of their speeches are performative speeches for the voters and not for other members of the chamber. So they're not having a deliberation or discussion about issues most of the time that they're speaking in the chamber. And we're left to assume that those discussions still take place to some degree, but they happen in private. They happen away from the cameras. It's one of the effects of bringing cameras into the chamber. It doesn't allow you to see the business of the chamber. It means the business can no longer occur in the chamber.
Right. And then if you've watched some congressional hearings lately, and I have on a couple of topics, that some of which I think many people would say are silly. Like I've watched the UAP hearings, right? But in general, in these hearings, like for instance, when they put RFK Jr. up to grill him, it was very clear that what they were doing and what they do is aim to create sound bites for C-SPAN.
Look at Cory Booker's entire career in Congress. Cory Booker, every time he speaks in Congress, his purpose is to have an effect on the home audience with the aim of running for president. Cory Booker's entire purpose is to run for president and to use being in the Senate to try to generate a situation in which he can successfully do that. All Cory Booker is interested in is being president. He doesn't care at all about the functions of Congress, which are increasingly thin and limited.
Right. Yeah. Well, I feel as though maybe we should, we have a few minutes left here, shift over into territory which is less political, but perhaps, I don't know, less depressing. I'm not quite sure, but
more depressing.
It's more depressing. It's this Kurt Vonnegut story that I wanted to discuss, a Harrison Bergeron story, which is probably one of the most well-known works of fiction by Vonnegut. I mean, there's Slaughterhouse-Five, which is his most well-known novel, and which was made into a movie in the 70s and sort of changed his trajectory and made him into a near household name for a while. But today, if young people are reading Vonnegut, they're most likely reading this story. It's been assigned in universities and even more, I think, in high schools. My son Noah read it. And it is an interesting pick out of Vonnegut's oeuvre, his body of work, that to present to people today, to hold on to. It's probably the themes of it are extremely familiar to most people. These are the themes of a Pixar movie, The Incredibles, but I do think it's a short story that deserves to be read today as well. What just to summarize, do you want to summarize it or shall I summarize?
Sure. And the crux of it is what's called in political theory the leveling down objection. So the leveling down objection is an objection to strict egalitarianism. The idea being that if you really were committed strictly to egalitarianism as a principle in and of itself, that this would require you to level down. So to blight or diminish any positive qualities that somebody has that would give them an unfair advantage. So since some people are blind and you can't give the blind people sight, the only way that you could follow a principle of strict egalitarianism, the argument goes, would be to blind everybody who can see.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore, if you elevate egalitarian equality in the strict sense as the master principle that guides everything that you do, it seems to produce very repugnant and repulsive outcomes. And then on the basis of this, the analytic philosopher will say, therefore, either equality is not the most important principle, or some of them will take the argument further and claim that equality doesn't matter at all and isn't at all important and is just a way of smuggling in other kinds of claims.
Right. And Vonnegut simply illustrates this argument in his short story, or it could be seen that he simply illustrates that philosophical position
in a very evocative way. So it's a case where this couple is watching television. The man is smarter than the woman, and because the man is smarter, he has sounds that play in his head every 20 seconds or so to disrupt his thinking so that he doesn't enjoy an unfair intellectual advantage. And then on television, there's someone who's broken out of a prison who
it's his son. It's that man's son. It's the couple's
that's son. Right. It's their son. Yeah. And he's genetically gifted, and he's thrown off all of the different things that they've done to him to try to limit him, attaching weight to his body, making him wear weird headgear, all of this. And, and he's declared himself the emperor of mankind. And of course, eventually they shoot him.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it's an interesting story in what in probably the most interesting character actually is Harrison. I think this is the name of the man who appears, their son, Harrison Bergeron, because of the way in which he rebels against the egalitarian society.
Yes, it's all feudal reactionary. I'm the emperor. I'll make you all dukes and lords. It's all that.
Yeah, and it's also, as is shown in the story, completely impossible and unrealistic in terms of sustaining any kind of real political change.
Right. His marginal advantages, being 7 feet tall and really buff and very smart, actually don't give him any kind of capacity to resist this system, not because the people who run the system are smarter than him or better than him in any way, but because it's an impersonal total system. It has much greater ability to leverage human cooperation than he can.
Right. And he doesn't even attempt really to leverage human cooperation. Well,
he tries to give a charismatic, authoritative, I'm Augustus Caesar kind of speech. He tries to show he has qualities that make him worthy of being followed. He tries to do the things that people but the time that it would take for him to actually do this, talk up enough people and make enough people his followers, is a time that would take far too long. They're able to much more quickly assemble the force that's necessary to shoot him before he can go around and say all of these things and socially organize all of these people together. So part of the story is also about the limitations of more conventional kinds of social organizing in a technologically advanced situation where the state is able to respond in a very small unit of time to activity.
Well, right. I mean, the Harrison Bergeron is sort of badly motivated, and that motive that he actually does embody the very authoritarian, totalitarian ideology that the egalitarian society is justifying itself against.
In part as reaction. It's in part because of the degree to which they suppressed him that he reacts to this degree and takes this up.
Right. Absolutely. But I discussed this story with Clint, who's one of our, one of the Sublation media team members, and he does the reading group, and he teaches this in high school as well. And he told me that I should take note of the fact that their son doesn't have any filial loyalty, doesn't start by trying to liberate his parents. He doesn't start with the people who are closest to him or show solidarity with others like himself who are weighted down or oppressed or made to be lesser than they could be by the system. He instead thinks narcissistically of himself and acts in a, to use a French term, a spectacular way. He goes to the media and tries to create the image of his liberation and domination rather than work through society, starting with the people he would know best.
Yes, and in the course of doing that, he draws a lot of attention to himself, which therefore allows the speed advantage of the state to
the
take
fact
its
that
full effect.
He sets himself up just so anybody could come in with a shotgun and take him out. He has no security of his own. He has no, right?
But it's noteworthy. This story was written, I think, in the early 60s. So, of course, they shotgun him. They don't drone strike him. There would be a lot of other ways to get him now. A lot of even more efficient, speedy ways to get him.
Right. No, right. And they also, the bureaucrat in charge of overseeing everyone's leveling down is the one who walks in with a shotgun. So it's like the top bureaucrat's going to do that.
Do it personally, do it themselves.
Right.
But it's the early 60s. A lot of these people are vets still.
Right. But how do you, so like when my son Noah read this story, he felt that he was being propagandized, and he opposed Harrison Bergeron and thought that the story didn't provide an adequate picture for liberation, or that the critique was unconvincing in some way.
Well, so if you go into the literature on the leveling down objection, lots of egalitarians will say that the leveling down objection attacks an iteration or conceptualization of equality, which is not the one that they have. They're not strict egalitarians. They have a much more nuanced and qualified and interesting conceptualization of equality. And that the leveling down objection, therefore, effectively attacks a straw man position that isn't widely held. That's the usual response from proponents of equality.
Yes. And I am a kind of egalitarian myself. I have my own thoughts about it based on Marxism, really. But one objection I would raise is that while there has been a leveling down in society, I think that there is a tendency to suppress differences and the aspects of people that are exceptional in the society. It isn't done so directly and as a matter of policy, right? And the reason why is because it's not actually the aim of society. It is an unfortunate product of the way in which we conduct our politics and our business affairs, I think. Has to do with monopolization.
Like the aim only if you're in a paranoid mode. It reminds me of something I said recently to somebody about vacuum cleaners. How you can't do any real serious thinking when there's a vacuum cleaner in the room. Because it's just too loud and it disrupts whatever it is that you're thinking about. There are a lot of things in our society that have that function, but they're not instituted for that purpose. They only appear that way in paranoid mode. But things, even including a lot of what goes on social media, I think has that function. If you spend a substantial amount of your day in various kinds of negative internet loops, particularly post-pivot to video, post-2016, post the total capture of the internet by the corporatized algorithms that have enshittified everything, there is a sense in which a lot of what goes on the internet now, rather than helping you to be able to construct arguments and think, now disrupts the capacity for thinking, is just a temptation to not do the serious work that you really ought to be doing. It's a problem. And also the need for authors to be their own marketers, to generate their own audiences, to get attention for themselves means that authors have to spend a lot of time outside of the work that they're meant to be doing, engaging in the pivot to video land. as
Right.
even we are doing here, arguably, but we're trying in some ways to fight the limitations of this as a form.
Right. I was thinking, right. I do think that the quality of our conversation is fairly high, but it's not as high as the quality of our writing, or even our videos or podcasts, if we were able to pause and take a lot more time to create these conversations and works.
Yeah, there's a speed need. We have to be able to say something that's relevant about the ongoing events taking place in Venezuela and Gaza. We have to have a conversation on a particular time scale, which means the amount of time that we can spend reading and preparing for any given episode is necessarily limited. And this is true for everybody. If you go and write a book about this, that's a really great book, it will come out years after these events have occurred. And
Right.
It will not be read very widely by very many people. It certainly will not help anybody to be able to make any decisions about the situation, because it will already be about events that have been superseded. So it becomes very difficult to use writing or the word or the text to have any kind of meaningful or substantive influence, except insofar as you write the text in a very general way, which militates against the modern emphasis on precision and clarity and exactness. So now to write a book that has real relevance, you have to write it vaguely and in a more mystical way.
Right.
Which changes the kind of writing that's competitive and changes the literary culture.
Yes. One other thing that I want to bring up is that even before the internet and the conditions we're under now, which are extremely intense, and push us to act quickly, just like, we're kind of like the Congress. We can't quite, so we become silly. But even before that, critics like Neil Postman noticed the way in which egalitarian impulses were working against critical thinking and true education, in books like Entertaining Ourselves to Death, railing against Sesame Street in that book.
Part of this is that people always want change to happen in their lifetime. So any transformations in consciousness that need to occur for the change to happen, this has to occur on a time preference that's relevant to the human lifespan. So there's a rushing of things that can't be rushed. And the tendency to rush things that can't be rushed only gets stronger as modernization moves further along and things happen faster. It means that there's even more of a desire to be quick than there would have been a century ago or 2 centuries ago. And that desire to be quick conflicts with the rhythm and tempo of human life. So it tends to produce projects that, because they are fast, are stupid, or because they are not stupid, are slow.
Yeah, but in the case of Neil Postman, just go back to the egalitarian side, not just the temporal side of it. You have to recall that the aim of Sesame Street and educational television in general was to overcome barriers to education that existed within a class society, and help unfortunate youth become educated by another means.
And do it immediately, right now, for this generation, through the TV, everybody at once, very quickly.
Right.
And that's the same thing that happens in this story. He tries to do it through the TV, everybody all at once, very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And that, of course, that millennial impulse to do everything through the internet and through Facebook and social media all at once, very quickly. It's the same kind of thing. It's a mistake in that lots of these things can't be done all at once, everybody, very quickly. But also you can see why it's a mistake that will endemically be made, because as things seem to happen faster, the desire to have a temporally relevant response and to reach a large enough people in a short enough unit of time that you're able to really make the transformative move will push people in this kind of direction. So it's not just a question of theory versus action. It's a question about speed and how long things take to do. And that, I think, is under-theorized and underappreciated. The need for speed is really a very critical thing. And it's becoming more critical over the course of our lifetimes in a way that we can notice. It matters more to be fast now than 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. You could say every decade it matters more to be fast.
Right. And that's not only due to human psychology or even due to technological change but it also has to do with, I mean, I guess this is tied to technology, but the rate of speed in the market, what comes to mind is the way computers trade stocks now.
High frequency trading. Yeah.
Yeah. And that can make a tremendous difference about which, over which companies are going to have monopoly power or succeed in the market, and which ones will go out of business. Is the speed in which you can trade, the
Yeah.
reaction time.
And why should you sit there and think about what you should buy or not buy? By the time you've come to a decision, all of that information is old. There's a sense in which if you really wanted to make the maximum amount of money on the market, you would not think yourself. You wouldn't. There's a disincentive to do it yourself because you are never fast enough.
Well, what we really need for everything now are time machines, so that we can live out our lives, think things through, and then go back and make the decision. And perhaps that's a book that I should write, and of course it's been written.
You see it in chess too, by the way. Sometimes I play chess, and chess is a completely different game if you play it with a clock. And it's a completely different game if you play it with a 10-minute clock versus a 5-minute clock versus a 2-minute clock. And there are people who are good at chess, but not good at it with a clock. And people who are good at it with a clock at one time frame, but not at a shorter time frame.
Mm-hmm.
It really dramatically changes everything, how much time there is on the clock.
Right. There are people who are very good at very short games of chess that when they're put up against another player and without the clock or with more time on the clock, they'll never win. Right.
Yeah. And the tendency in chess is to valorize the person who wins with a long clock. Somebody who can win with a 2-hour clock is usually considered the grandmaster, the best chess player. But in real life, the advantages are going to people who are good at playing on very short times, even if those people would not be great in a game that would take longer to play.
I'll say this. I have to say this. The Campaign for a Socialist Party is playing without a clock. And I do think that it may
be the advantages and disadvantages that implies.
Right. That's right. In some ways that is a disadvantage, but it is the only way for radicals to really play the game. We can't compete on the team at the speed that capitalism operates. I just don't think that's possible.
Yeah. For Marxists, isn't that an interesting problem? If you're, anti-capitalist, then of course we don't work on capitalist time. We work on revolutionary time, and revolutionary time is different. But if you're a Marxist and you have to get there in and through capitalism, then there is a suggestion that being out of time with it is a problem, and being much slower than it would be evidence of being reactive and not really going
but the
it.
alternative is to stay the way in which Marxists remain, give themselves the sense that they're keeping up, is by never changing, by never being even remotely close to being on
and by
time.
Dismissing the relevance of new developments.
Right, exactly.
That's a problem.
Yeah, and so you have to take the time to understand new developments, even if that means by the time you fully understand them, they're not going to be completely new. It's a difficulty, but the hope is that by creating institutions which will operate through their own time, we can overcome this difficulty, because the decisions that have to be made right now for Marxists don't really involve political power or military movement or anything like that. Right now, we're at the level of trying to gather our strength and deepen our understanding, and so we can't do those things on the clock. Not a 2-minute clock or 10
And there's
second.
a lot of people whose objection will just be, this doesn't operate on the time preference that I have. I think that's more often than not, that theory action debate is really a time preference debate. It's people going, but this doesn't operate on our time preference.
Well, maybe we should take that up next week. Listen, it was a good episode. Now I feel like I'm caught up. I'm in this moment. Maybe probably last week. I'm just caught up to last week. But in any case, I'm caught up with the times, and I look forward to talking to you again next week. And people should go to Patreon. I'm going to most likely have a second hour, a debrief with Rudy Grieser in Germany, and I look forward to that. And this sublation is holding right now, but we're gonna, in time, we're gonna get everything back on its feet and watch what we do then. So I'll see you in a week.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living